One of the biggest ideas in Jungian theory and practice to come to grips with is the shadow. So let's see what that is. Everyone who's heard of the book of Genesis knows that in the beginning there was light. That light was not the light from the sun or the moon or the stars. Those didn't even show up until the fourth day of creation. That light was the light of consciousness. Consciousness did and does create everything. In Jungian theory and practice, that consciousness is known as the conscious ego. Everything else, Jung called the shadow. Everyone has a shadow. Men have it. Women have it. The shadow isn't evil. It's just the living embodiment of everything you have in you right now that you've never developed. So your shadow, when it comes up in your dreams, will look very different from you, although it will be of the same sex. In fact, it will be the opposite of what you are, personality-wise. If you see my presentation of the personality types, you'd be familiar with this diagram. The circle is the barrier between you and the outside world. Within that barrier are the archetypes. Here, the femme fatale, the good father, the magician, and the great mother. Your shadow is also an archetype. Again, no matter what your physical, sexual nature or your personality type. It's important to understand that in Jungian theory and practice, darkness isn't just a lack of light. Darkness, the shadow, is a living creature, and it's a creature with a purpose. It's trying to stretch and work the conscious ego. In the end, it wants to make it bigger, broader, more robust. It wants to bring more light. Your shadow is alive. Your shadow is not your conscious ego. These are two different things. It is very important that you understand that, because your shadow will show up in dreams, and your shadow will lurk around the corner and will come out and attack you if you're not careful. Careful means getting a grip on it. It's easy to keep pushing where we're strong. Maybe we're a little lazy or tired. We live in an extroverted society. If our shadow's introverted, we don't want to dwell on it because it's considered navel-gazing. Maybe we're making money at it. Maybe we come from an abusive family and we couldn't work on our blind side. But be careful. The shadow is a living creature, and when it's ignored, when it's not worked, it will erupt into open opposition. This is a complex. So as you can imagine, when you have too much unconscious psychic content, it's very hard to come to grips with the world the way it is. For one thing, you're not using all of your tools. By definition, the shadow is a part of your psyche that hasn't been developed. If you're too much of a thinker, your feelings aren't very well developed. If you're too much of an intuit, your sensation isn't that well developed. But for another, you have a separate personality lurking around in there, and if you are too unconscious, it will erupt into conscious opposition to the conscious ego. And that's a problem. But there's another problem with having too much unconscious psychic content. Portions of your psyche that you haven't brought into consciousness get projected. Projection is a consistently unconscious act. You can project things about yourself that you like onto other people, onto things, onto situations. This is called the golden shadow. Or if there are things about yourself that you hate, these are things that aren't evil, these are just things that you haven't developed very well. This is also projection. When you come across somebody where the chemistry is just bad, you're probably projecting. So problems lead to more problems. On top of everything else, we're projecting. We're reacting to the projections, and these projections have little, if anything, to do with the people that we're projecting onto. So what is to be done? We integrate the shadow, and we withdraw the projections. There are all sorts of things we can do, well-known strategies that can be resorted to so that we can do that. You can go out on the internet and you can find all sorts of books. I used Shadow Dance by David Richo. Like any decent Jungian-inspired therapist, David Richo spends a lot of time convincing you that the shadow insinuates itself into your own life and into society in general a lot more aggressively than you think it does. On page 149 of the book, we read this. There are three main ways by which we invite the shadow into our lives. We deny the existence of a shadow by being overly trusting of others. We have poor personal boundaries, and thus become easy prey to predators. We act from a fear-based motivation. I'm going to walk through this again because it's very important. An unexamined shadow can reach up from the darkness that you've locked it into and drive you right over a cliff. But it gets even worse, because our shadows can constellate, and when they do, collective shadows get cast on groups of people that we don't like, and the result can be genocide. Unexamined shadows can come way short of genocide and still ruin a life and make a society a miserable, half-assed place to live. So I think everybody needs to go and work with their shadow. There are lots of books out there. You can look them up on the internet. You can use Rico's book. But beyond that, there's all sorts of exciting spiritual and psychological work to do. But it begins with the first step of dealing with the shadow.